All right, welcome back to basketball, ladies and gents. My name's Parker Ainsworth. I'll be your host this evening with Kyle Edwards. Kyle, how we doing, man?
Doing swell, my dude.
All
Thanks for having
good.
me on.
For sure, man. And so I have you on not intentionally because the Wizards are playing right now, but you are a Washington, D.C. guy. And the Wizards, I think, are putting up quite a fight tonight. Obviously, they're facing an uphill battle, 3-1. I guess Joel Embiid is out. But have you gotten to catch any of that game so far?
A little bit. I was intrigued with the Doc Rivers' decision to place Tybal in the starting lineup opposed to Dwight Howard, which to me seemed like more the natural fit to like put a center into the starting lineup. But I think that's kind of like playing down to the Wizards because it's the same team who was playing, 6'3" Bradley Beal at the 4.
Right. Well,
as recently as Game 3.
And they were putting Rui Hachimura outside, right? He shot a couple three. He had a big game last game, right? Probably the best game of his career, or thus far, I should say. He's a young guy, but it is interesting to go Thibault. I love Thibault. I just would have, like you're saying, I would have thought they'd stick big. I guess maybe Ben Simmons has played a little bit more close to the basket tonight, but it hadn't been like he's playing the center. So, anyway, that game is currently.
It's interesting. It's interesting to experiment now. I saw that it's like Embiid has a slight tear in his meniscus, which is the same injury that Andrew Bynum had in the 2010 playoffs. So I don't know if you're ready to write off Philadelphia or maybe this small ball experiment with Simmons at the 5 is maybe what they need against Brooklyn, but I'm ready to write them off.
You're done with it.
Not this series. Don't let's not get that mistaken.
I think that it's interesting because obviously, and we'll get into all NBA teams and stuff in a second. A guy like Joel Embiid's had an MVP type year. It's hard to imagine that they can really there's no team where you take the best player off that they're going to go really far in the playoffs, right? Like that's just, you take LeBron off the Lakers, you take either Chris Paul or Devin Booker, your pick off the Suns, you take Gobert or Donovan Mitchell. We saw the Jazz lose to the Grizzlies without Donovan Mitchell, right? Like you take those guys off, they're just not the same team. But it really seems to be a big deal to Philly because they have 2 All-Stars, whereas like the Nets have 3, the Bucks fancy themselves to have a big 3. It's a much bigger deal for them, it feels like.
Yeah, it's just a popular buzzword has been the heliocentric type of fits, such as like Luka with the Mavericks. But it's Daryl Morey was praised for like building this superior spaced team, this better roster from last year's Philadelphia team, and now it's like, all right, well, what are we going to get from Ben Simmons? So
yeah, we're literally resting on what do we get from Ben Simmons? Sorry, Bill Simmons, a slip of sorts.
Speaking of Bill Simmons, though, we're talking about like losing your star player, and it's like where like the Ewing theory fits in.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know if everyone's read the Big Book of Basketball, but the Ewing theory has to do with the Knicks, the 90s. You want to go on? Because that is fascinating.
It has to do with the Knicks in the 1999 playoffs. In the lockout shortened year, they lost Patrick Ewing, and then led by Marcus Camby, Latrell Sprewell, Allen Houston, ended up making it to the NBA Finals, improbably.
Right.
And knocked off like the 1-seeded Miami Heat that year, led by Alonzo Mourning. And it's just the concept that like maybe if you lose your best player, it's better for you in the short term. But anyway, I know you got some all NBA.
Well, it stems from the idea that like a team's got to figure out what you're doing next really quickly, because in a playoff series like that, like you don't have a lot of time to figure stuff out, so they don't have the time to like game plan and adjust to how you play without Patrick Ewing or how you play without Joel Embiid. Although I say so, they just into the third quarter, the Wizards are down by 9. That's the NBA TV game, but I figured you'd at least have an eye on that one. The Knicks-Hawks are the TNT game. The Hawks are up by 7 in the third. I admittedly haven't watched much of that one at all because I was watching the other game. But I got to assume if that's Knicks-Hawks, that's Trey Young, which kind of ties us into our first, where'd it go? Our first hot tea cold brew question. So hot tea cold brew is just the segment we do to start the show every week. Hot tea cold brew is brought to you by Yeti coolers, cups, and koozies. Yeti's the go-to shop for keeping things hot or cold, just like NBA stories. Yeti is based out of Austin, Texas. Check the links in our social media handles for all your insulated needs for tailgating, camping, and daily life. Yeti is built for the wild. So I'm going to ask you some questions, and I kind of want to hear, like, do you think they're hot, like there's a lot going on there, or they're cold, like, there's not a whole lot going on there. And I just want to hear what your thoughts are, because I open up this first one, or the first couple, really, because you were on the show last, actually, kind of around the All-Star game, and we're talking about guys missing or being snubbed from the All-Star game, right? And you said something on the show that I don't know if you realized was as, like, intelligent as maybe you. I mean, you're a smart guy. Maybe you knew it was intelligent, but I've always thought of All NBA as being this much bigger honor that we don't talk about as much, right? The All-Star, we get to watch a game, so we want to see what happens. But All NBA is less spots. It's a more credible. They're not as big a fan say in it, right? And those kinds of things, and that kind of gets pushed to the side. It's a full season thing versus a half season thing. And you said very bluntly, like, this All-Star thing's for fun. Like, why are we worried about snubs back then? And I was like, yes, thank you. Somebody said it. And so I was excited to get you on after the regular season's been over to talk about some of these guys, and are they all NBA guys? The first hot tea cold brew question actually starts with a guy that was snubbed from the All-Star game and had a tremendous second half of the regular season. And frankly, he has a great start to the first half of the playoffs, and that's Trey Young. So hot tea cold brew, Trey Young should be on an all-NBA team.
Big facts. Hot, steaming, lava-like. It's I've come the furthest on Trey Young than any player this season, and perhaps it was because I didn't watch enough Atlanta Hawks games, but it's like he just has this, like, we always talked about in like the 2016 Warriors run, how Steph was changing the game in live time. And we're seeing that with Trey, but I don't think exactly to the extent to which we expected. Like, I think we expected guys to be shooting from 30 feet, like guys with a more slight build being able to dominate, whether they're going outside or inside. And, like Steph, like Trey's got an amazing paint package, although it's not really around the cup as much as it is by floater. But he just has this like incomprehensible ability to like just astonish. And I think that's what makes him such a polarizing player. Like, guys getting upset about like him, like leaning into guys, drawing fouls. I mean, I'm sure it drives you crazy, Parker. What do you think?
So it's funny you bring up Steph, because I think he's this interesting combination of Steph and then I'm a Rockets guy, of Harden, right? The way that he draws fouls in the 5 to 15 foot range, right? And if you're not close enough to foul him, he shoots a floater over the top of you. And he has the Steph Curry type, Dame Lillard type range, right out 4 or 5 steps behind the 3-point line. And it's not that he shoots he's not shooting 42% from 30, 35 feet. It's that he's shooting roughly no different from 35 feet or 30 feet as he is from on the line, right? And so you have to cover him the same way that far away as you would at the 3-point line. They've also done a great job in Atlanta with Capella down low as a roller. Absolutely. And then they got Collins playing outside. They got Hunter and Bogdanovich spreading the floor too. Like, they've got a great set of guys around him to really maximize his skill set. And the second half of the year, as they got healthier, they got rid of Rondo, and that really opened up a lot of things for him. You really liked watching Trey Young, though. So talk to me about what you really liked about the second half of the year.
So what I sort of had to like train myself to consider while watching Trey Young is exactly what you just said, is that he's more like Harden than he is Steph. Because I'm a little biased towards scorers who don't look like they're working very hard to score. So like, as much as I love watching Steph, as much as I love watching Kyrie, I always prefer like the Harden, the Luka Doncic types, the Durants, the guys where it's like, they just score like 10 points a quarter and then just like, somehow it's like, oh, he's got 40. How'd that happen? But with Trey, I think it's like this he has this ability to astonish, and whether he's like sticking around pick and rolls, whether he's like taunting all of New York City.
I love it.
with just like true cojones factor threes and floaters, and he's polarizing in much the same way like a Cam Newton was at his peak with Carolina, and I just think that this guy led his team from outside playoff contention to the 5 seed, likely to face the number 1 seed Sixers down Embiid, led one of the best offenses in the NBA. And say what you will about his defense, and we're going to get to this when we talk about Zion, but it's just like he's established himself as this guy, a lot like Luka, a lot like Zion, where if he's on your team, you're going to have a top 10 offense, like no matter what.
Yeah, because it's a weird sense of like he is oddly efficient doing these things that are inefficient. And it's so he checks all those boxes. And again, it's not that he's shooting 40+% from deep or anything like that. It's that it's over 35, and that's good enough, right? Like that means you have to cover him from that far away. I will say it's fascinating too that maybe I lost it amidst the losses in the early half of the season. I didn't watch Atlanta play. They were losing so many games in the first half of the season that it really did feel like a revelation to me when I can't honestly say that he played poorly the first half. Atlanta played poorly the first half. He's their best player. So I think in my head, I interpreted that he played poorly for the first half. But I don't guess I necessarily have a whole lot of visual evidence for that. I could go back and watch tape, but I haven't done that.
Well, there was the Athletic story about sort of the disgruntlement in the locker room between him and John Collins. And
yeah,
I thought it was interesting. You were talking about like the Hawks roster. You didn't mention John Collins.
Well, so I'm thinking, guys, he spaced it out some, but I'm thinking about guys spacing the floor out, right? He is a better shooter than Capella is. He spreads it out more so than that.
And also just one of maybe the best guy in the NBA at slipping the screen.
Yeah.
And just like rolling to the basket. I'm interested to see what happens there. But anyway, I think that, for my last All NBA slot, kind of came down to like Bradley Beal versus Trey Young. But I think what we learned about Bradley Beal this year, and this is just total objectivity here, is like, he can get you between 28 and 36 every night, but he's not going to lead you to a top 10 offense the same way Trey Young will always be able to for years and years to come. So I think just for that, and it's just like, maybe you could put Beal on more teams. Maybe he's just more flexible, and that's what makes him such like a intriguing trade piece. But I think that what Trey Young did this season for Atlanta, I don't think Bradley Beal will ever come close to touching that.
No, I think that's a fair point. And Trey's also doing it at an earlier stage of his career, and who knows, how high the ceiling is there. I'm going to flip flop too because you started to segue me into one that I want to hear now. It's really what's going to be my third, but I'm going to make it second. Hot tea, cold brew. The Wizards, your Wizards, have 2 All NBA guys. I say that mostly because I've heard people talk about both Russ and Bradley Beal as like, oh my God, what a year they
Daniel
had.
Gafford and Robin Lopez.
No, not Robin Lopez. But hot tea, cold brew, the Washington Wizards have 2 All NBA guys.
Cold brew.
So talk me through that, because I'm also cold on it. We'll talk about our respective groups we made in a second. I didn't have either on my 3 NBA teams, and I'm sorry if that offends some people. But you had Bradley Beal fighting for the scoring title and Russell Westbrook getting another triple-double, and we leave them both. We both left them both off. So why or at least I left them both off, I should say. So why is that? Like,
it's we touched on this when we spoke in February about the All-Star Game snubs, and what it comes down to is like, who are you taking off? Like, it's nothing against these guys, but if you were just to if we were to sit here, we were to break down like the top 15 players in the NBA, we would see that like, whoa, like, wait, hold on a second. Like, Kyrie's like the 13th best player in the NBA. Like it's just that it's the league is so robust with high end talent, especially guards.
Especially guards.
Like you look at like the top four All NBA. It's like all right, Steph, Luka, you got Damian Lillard, and then it's like, well, we kind of like splitting hairs between Chris Paul, Kyrie Irving, Trey Young. Like, who are you knocking out of that group? And I watched a lot of Wizards basketball at the beginning of the season when Russ was terrible, and I just it's hard not to look at it as like a full body of work. Like, who is the most outstanding players at their positions this season? And I think if anything, Russ seems more like an all-star snub than he did back in February. I think the All-Star game could have used some Russ instead of like Levine, but nothing against Zach Levine. But it's just a matter of like who you taking out, and I don't know who that guy is.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the biggest thing to me is I could maybe put one of them above a forward if I'm looking at forwards. Like Kevin Durant didn't play a lot of games this year, right? Or something like that. The backcourt guys, Steph, Dame, Harden, Chris Paul, Trey, Kyrie, Devin Booker. Like they're just Levine. There's so many. It's just if we're going to stick with this positionally picking things, it's going to be hard as a guard. And part of that's because like it's also hardest to make the league as a guard, right? There's just more people between 5'11" and 6'4" than there in the world. It's just tougher competition. And part of it is also just how tremendous those guys are, right? Like, how are you going to look at Steph Curry's year and not have him on the team, or Damian Lillard? And like, we're recording on a Wednesday, right? So like last night we just saw Damian Lillard go off. I know this is a regular season award, but like, ooh, what a night, right? Speaking of guys, when you talk about like taking someone off, a hot name going back to our conversation in February, a hot name at the All-Star time was like, is Zion going to make it? Is he going to get a fan vote? Those kind of things. And now we're looking at all NBA teams, and the Pelicans did not make the playoffs. They did not make the play-in. But he had a tremendous year as this point Zion. And so my hot tea cold brew question to you is, Zion Williamson should be on an all-NBA team. You hear that and you think what?
Yes. Hot. I'm hot on that one. And the reason for that is I don't think that the Pelicans not making the playoffs is any fault of his. Honestly, you look at their roster, it's like, all right, they got all those draft picks from Milwaukee. I wish they would have taken under more consideration how Bledsoe fit that roster. Maybe they should have gone with George Hill.
Yeah, the Bledsoe thing felt like a throw-in, and it didn't feel like they thought about it much at all, or it didn't feel like they thought about the way it fits the puzzle much at all.
Not at all. And it's like, like you had like two pick and roll half court guys in Bledsoe and Adams, kind of later in their careers. You had two transition guys and Zion and Lonzo. And then you had like, like a guy who just wants to like face up 15 feet or at the nail and just ISO you to death. And David Griffin, I think he's done amazing job sometimes, but I don't think we should hold that against Zion. And this is like sort of like, as I see it, like a most outstanding kind of honor. And like I said, like off the top of my head, I think the Pelicans finished top 8 in offensive efficiency.
I believe in large part because he was putting up Shaquille O'Neal type shooting percentages, true shooting percentages, etc. It was all around the cup and it was all high percentage shots.
And it's his gravity, and he really came around as like a passer also in my eyes. But it's like his gravity, and it's like there are just certain guys, and maybe like it's a bigger list than it's ever been, but certain guys you have to game plan against them every single night. And Zion proved this year that he's one of the hardest players to game plan against, because who are you sticking on him?
Right. No, you put a big fella like Rudy Gobert on him, he's going to the basket around him. You put someone quicker to guard him, he's going over them. I will say, so I looked up on Basketball Reference, you said that they were 9th in points per game and 24th in allowed points per game. When factoring in pace, their offensive rating dipped a little bit. But like you're saying, the deal was nothing on the defensive ratings, and defensive points per games are not on a single player ever. I did have him off of mine. Not because I loved Point Zion. My bigger thing was I ran into, for starters, I had Luka as a forward. I think that's an interesting, like where you put Luka on your chart impacts that. And then I don't know. I put Durant in mine, which will segue me into the next question. And I think there are going to be a lot of people that don't put Durant on because of how few games he played. But I see the games he played, and I'm like, I saw him get 40 back-to-back nights. so I think that's just the way different people are valuing things. And so we can talk about this kind of together, because the next hot tea cold brew question is the Nets have 3 All-NBA guys. And so because I had all 3 in there, I didn't actually have space for Zion, much like I didn't have space for a Brad Beal. Did you not have one of the 3 Nets, or how'd you find space for Zion?
I had all 3.
Okay, so now we got to go through, because I also had all 3. We agree there. That could be a boring conversation. But talk me through your first, second, third team. What do you got lined out?
Well, so you're preaching to the choir, talking about how just Durant's body of work in the games he played, to me, is the reason why, for me, he's first team All-NBA. And, maybe I'm just kind of sticking with legacy. I also had LeBron, first team All-NBA forward. And then Harden, second team, Kyrie, third team. Before we go into like our full rosters, I'm curious where you had each of the Nets' big 3.
I had Harden second team, and I had Durant and Kyrie third team, because that first versus third is where I knocked Durant for games played. But I did have Durant on the third team, where I think some people that were talking about games played just left him off. But I saw each of them carry that roster at different points of the year, and so I feel like I had to have all 3.
I mean, I think I'm valuing it on who carried the roster the best, and I believe that, Kyrie was tremendous in the games where he played without Harden and Durant, but he's I saw somebody call him Alfred the Butler. Well, and just like in the context of like he didn't want to be Robin to LeBron's Batman, but now he's Alfred. Anyway, he's the third option. That's sort of like how I see their pecking order, first, second, third.
Yeah. So talk to me then. You said you also had LeBron first team. It's, if we're giving game away too much, I think I could guess your first team, but who did you have first team All NBA as you mapped it out?
There's some legacy there. I know that's corny. That's we should celebrate these, like the new life. But for me, Curry, Luka. I think maybe the hardest decision I had to make was between Luka or Lillard first team. I ended up going with Luka, just because Dame's got the clutch time stats, but I think just Luka's offensive creation and pick and rolls, and just the way he would dissect defenses in the half court. Because Dallas is it's amazing. Like, Dallas had one of the worst fast break offenses in the league, and they still had like one of the best offenses.
Yeah,
which is insane.
I also give Carlisle credit there, but yes, that is a weird number to look at.
I mean, you look at Carlisle's track record, like they're always one of the better, most efficient offenses in the NBA. But for Luka, for me, it was just his second half of the season. Now he's integrating his mid-range game. Just from the first night of the year, I remember he was getting hounded by Mikal Bridges, and he just took him to the block, just bully ball. Yeah. And I love that he added that new layer to his game. So I have them, and then Durant, LeBron, and then my MVP, Nikola Jokic.
So I also had Jokic in my team. I had Steph and Dame. I think there was a period of the year where we were looking at can Dame play his way into being an MVP? And I think the way he stretches the floor is important. I think the way he finishes games is important. I know it's a regular season award, but I think the way we see him put a team on his back like we did last night in the playoffs is important. And I don't mean that it has to be in the playoffs, but that was an example of a time that he's done that. I had Giannis and Kawhi as my forwards on the first team. I was, if people listen to my Effin Sports podcast, I am really high on Giannis and the Bucks this year. I know that they didn't have the win total they had in 2019-20 before the season broke early. I think, honestly, if he did not win one of those two MVPs, we'd be like, there would not be the MVP fatigue with the way he played this year, because there is. I agree that it's a Nikola Jokic kind of year, right? And I'm not trying to take anything away from the Joker, but I'm really high on Giannis. And then I had Kawhi on my first team because I had LeBron on my second team. And I think it's worth pointing out that Kawhi did not play necessarily all 72 games, but he played a lot of games for the Clippers, and the Clippers were very good. And I think that gets kind of lost because everyone's like waiting to see how they do in the playoffs, right? Talk to me about, well, let's talk about Luka, because Luka's on my second team as a forward. I see him being in the LeBron light as far as like the point forward style, where he can beat up your little guards or your little guys, like you're talking about Mikal Bridges and those kind of things. I also see him running the point, so I get why people put him as a guard. He runs their offense. But I had him, and it might be cheating so I can fit all my guards in. I had him as a forward on my list, so he's a second team forward for me. Who's in your second team?
So my second team, I had Dame, Harden. I had your first team front court with Giannis and Kawhi. MVP fatigue aside, I think that we saw the Bucks experiment a little bit this year. That's why they didn't have the same win total that they've had the past two seasons. But I mean, that's what everyone wanted Budenholzer to do.
Right.
Like try switching, try PJ Tucker at center a little bit. And maybe they didn't do things as much as we would have liked. I think that they kind of learned from their mistakes in years past. And we see that with the sweep of the Miami Heat, which is one of the most, anyway.
No, I would agree that people are writing that off as Miami Heat must be bubble frauds, and I wouldn't go that far. I think that's just how impressive Milwaukee is. But anyway, I would tend to agree there. Who's your center on your second team?
Easy choice there. It was Embiid, who, Jokic is my MVP, just for him to play all 72 games, the kind of availability, the consistency he had. But it's I don't know if you heard that Hoop Collective podcast argument between Brian Windhurst and Tim McMahon. Go back and listen to it. But they got really heated about this MVP debate before Embiid missed some more time. But he really was I know Zion scored in the paint as well as anybody since Shaq, but watching Embiid this season from night one against the Wizards, it was like watching Shaq. I just don't know how you guard that guy without a double team.
Yeah.
It's funny. I think Jokic, you're better off not doubling. It seems, if you have a stout center, but Embiid, I just don't know how you guard him without doubling. And there was a game against the Warriors this year where they were going small with Draymond at the center, and they get the ball into Embiid, and it's just sort of a 1-2, drop step and one bucket. And you saw Draymond yelling at the Warriors bench, which is fascinating because usually you see him yelling at the ref in that context. But
yeah, it's
he was either saying hey, put a center in here, or help me with a double.
Do something.
He was just
this did not work.
I can't do this. This is not going to work. And all the guys I've seen Draymond guard, I have never seen him just kind of ask for help in that that ever before.
He's a former defensive player of the year. If guarding centers at 6'8" is kind of his thing. I think what's fascinating about Joel Embiid is, having not heard the Windhorst McMahon argument you're talking about, I feel
Bontemps, excuse me.
Bontemps. I think Embiid had the MVP locked up had he played 62 plus games, right? Had he, because they had the number one seed in the East, that counts to a lot of people as where your team falls, right? He did feel unguardable, and this might be simplistic of me, but because you have to double him, there is a defensive strategy like you're talking about with Jokic where it's better to just let him get 30 points and not double him because he's such a phenomenal passer that I think people value demanding a double team. And I don't know why I think that's important, but I think that they're like the same way that we saw Greg Popovich scheme Steve Nash off the floor one time by, I think it was the 07 playoff run. It was one of those good middle 2000s Spurs runs where like he just said, fine, we'll let Steve Nash get 40. No one else is like he was like, we can't let this mastermind of a creator dish the ball because we can't recover and we don't know where it's coming from there, right? I think that that's the way to play Jokic as well. And I think that visually it's more impressive to see like people get caught up in how many times they've got to double Embiid. They got to double, and they don't get caught up in the Jokic the same way. But anyway, Embiid did miss the games he missed. That bumps him to my second team. I had Harden and Paul as my backcourt there. You haven't mentioned Chris Paul. Are we gonna have a Chris Paul snub or?
I'm leaning towards Chris Paul snub, just because again, we talk about just how robust this crop of guards is, and I think when you look at them, it's hard to make the statistical argument that Chris Paul deserves to be on this team. And I think he's sort of like in my Russell Westbrook tier in that way. And, leadership aside, I don't know how you can make that argument for Chris Paul without just sort of like just reducing the kind of year Devin Booker had. No, I think this is a situation where they're taking votes from each other.
That could be fair. I'm partial to Chris Paul. I did put Chris Paul on the second team. Part of me did feel like I had to have a Phoenix Sun on there, like a representative, because of what they were doing. And again, I may be overly simplistic there. And I do think, weirdly, that moving Luka to a forward kind of gave me another guard spot. My third team, I had Trey and Kyrie as my backcourt. I don't know that I cut either one if I move Luka around. Anyway, who's on your third team? Because I'm interested in one of your forwards, but I want to know what you put.
As we talked about earlier, I had Trey, I had Kyrie. I think the deal breaker for Kyrie in my eyes was the 50-40-90 season, and this is perhaps it's because he's the third option now, but he wasn't the third option for so much of the season when he did play. But he's as efficient as he's ever been. I think that he has the deepest bag of anybody in the league. And say what you will, all respects to like Jason Tatum, Steph Curry, Jokic. I think he's the most fun player to watch in my opinion. But Kyrie, Trey, Zion, Gobert at center. And for my final forward spot, I was between Paul George and Jimmy Butler. And I ended up going with PG on that one.
Gotcha. So I went with Rudy. I mentioned earlier why I had Durant on the third team. And then I had Trey and Kyrie. My last spot, and it was also a forward spot. My last spot was Jason Tatum. And I can't tell if that's I enjoy watching him play. I can't tell if that's because I'm picking this after 10 days of the playoffs and I'm like kind of cheating in my head a little bit without meaning to. I don't know. Boston did only get the 7th seed, and we'll talk more about the Celtics in a second and the fallout from their season ending. But Jason Tatum had a lot on his shoulders besides that big ass tattoo, right? There's a lot sitting on those things to carry that team, and he's got another All-Star on it, and he's got, when healthy, Kemba Walker and Marcus Smart's really good, and I thought their coach was supposed to be this super genius, like. Tatum carries a lot of the load in that franchise, and I feel like it gets lost because some of it becomes mid-range pull-ups, and when those aren't falling, they look really bad to take, and those kind of things. I was really impressed with Jason Tatum throughout the year, and so I ended up putting Jason Tatum on my third team, which I think means that their fallouts are that much more haunting. But you didn't have Tatum in your top, so he'd be my first, Kyle snubbed Jason Tatum. He'd be the first one I'd call out for you on that.
I wouldn't say I'm a Jason Tatum hater. but I understand why people would like look at it this way. But for me, I think that he has, as amazing as he is, I think he has such a long way to go, just in terms of like kind of like rising the group that he plays with. Because I think you saw it this season with Boston, and I think a lot of this falls on Danny Ainge, and whether that was like the botched Hayward free agency, not making the move for Miles Turner, signing Tristan Thompson, Jeff Teague. Like I think they had as bad a front office offseason as any team in the league did this year. But I just would have liked to have seen Tatum sort of elevate his teammates more. And what I think I mean by that is like I just need to see like more north-south action out of him. Like
Gotcha.
Right now for me, it's like he's working too hard on those like like turnaround 15-footers, the step back threes, and sometimes it works. Like I remember the shot he made against Giannis where kind of went off glass. Glass. But I just I think it's the issue with Brad Stevens coach teams the past years, and Zach Lowe was talking about this in an earlier podcast this year, but they don't get enough north-south action to the basket. And we haven't really talked about Boston yet, but I'm interested to see who they hire and how they change their offensive philosophy next year.
Yeah, we will get to the Boston fallout from today, I promise, folks at home listening. But I think that the criticism on Tatum goes side to side too much, or you're saying north south, so I guess that means he's going east west too much. I think you got to
get that north south action. I think the best offensive players in the league, Trey, Luka, Harden, LeBron, they that's what they do as well as anything, and I just don't see that enough with Tatum. And I think that's what he's got to work on more than anything to really reach his ceiling, because he's not there yet.
No, and I think that's a fair criticism. I will say that the stuff he does going east-west is not great basketball from a winning perspective, and it's stuff that is impressive because, like, holy crap, that's really hard to do. I think so. If I have Tatum on mine, I think Zion is the obvious, if I'm looking at my own lists, snub, and you explained why Zion ought to be in the list, so I don't need to digress there too much more. Zion had a tremendous year. I'm not anti-point Zion. I am not anti-Stan Van Gundy. I do kind of like Stan Van Gundy. My guy that neither of us had that I think is interesting is we both only had one representative from the Milwaukee Bucks. You didn't have Middleton. I didn't have Middleton. I didn't know where I would have fit him in. I didn't have, like you're saying, I didn't have anyone I could take off and like Middleton should go there. And so that's the way the cookie crumbled for me. Do you see Middleton as a snub, like he's not good enough, or a snub like there just aren't enough spots?
I don't think he's good enough. All and right. I love his game. I think that the media and NBA Twitter at large criticize the Bucks too much for going to Middleton late game situations, and not just like on offensive matchup, but also defensive matchup. Like I understand why Budenholzer goes that direction, but at the same time, how many second options do we have on this list?
Well, that's I mean, except for like, do you want to call the Nets guys? like I don't know which one of them you call second, but that's the only team, as I look at it, that I believe that's the only team we have more than one guy from.
Yeah, that's kind of what it comes down to for me, at least, is I want to reward guys who were the number one option, and in Gobert's case, the number one, sort of like focal point of the offense, even though he wasn't getting the most touches. But I want to reward those guys that our teams are game planning against every night more than anybody else on their roster.
So I think the number one option is interesting because that kind of like my next question is like, ooh, these are two number twos. I also, neither one of us had Anthony Davis. Is that a function of games played on your end? Because I think that's what it came down to for me.
I think with Davis, and I think I'm letting my biases get into this. Like you mentioned, like I think you were saying, who were you saying you're biased towards off the playoffs so far?
Tatum. I'm 100% counting. Tatum. Subconsciously in my head, I know that he had a 50-point playoff game where he had to do everything. Like I know that's completely part of it.
I think with Davis, it's like I'm frustrated with and I understand why the Lakers don't play him at center all year. Like he struggles to stay on the court. Like Barkley called him street clothes last night during the TNT broadcast.
Yeah,
but it's just sort of a function of how the Lakers use him and how they've used Andre Drummond, where it's frustrating to me to just watch him shoot face up and go like 15-footer after 15-footer. And I think he kind of gets complacent with those guard skills he grew up with. And he's really one of the most frustrating players for me to watch in the NBA. And I think I'm letting my biases get involved from that standpoint. But I think Gobert deserved it more than him, whether you want to go center forward. I'm curious whether you would classify him as center or forward.
Well, so I think that's the telling thing. Much like I moved Luka to a forward because I see him as a point forward, I think I would also put Davis as a forward. You brought up him being frustrating to watch, and it's weird to see how those jump shooting stats in the bubble played out this year, right? Everyone's talked about it, so I don't think it's shedding news to anyone, but players shot better in the bubble, whether that's Tyler Hero, whether that's the kid on the Pacers.
Jay Crowder.
Jay Crowder's on the Suns now. The kid on the Pacers is like 50 one night. But
TJ Warren.
TJ Warren, yeah. And then Anthony Davis, his was sometimes mid-range, but also jump shooting. And everyone else kind of, except for Tyler Hero, everyone else has kind of adjusted this year. And Anthony Davis continues to focus or rely on jump shooting that does not work the same way. And I think frustrating was a good word choice by you there, because you want him to do the put your head down and go to the basket. You're 7 feet tall. You want him to do that every time, right? Like it doesn't make why aren't you doing that every time? Why aren't we running double drag with you as the roller? Why are we running double drag with you as the popper? Like those kind of things don't make sense. But the real reason I didn't have him on my list comes down to more about how few games he played versus the other forwards I had on my list. The only comparable amount of games played was Kevin Durant, and I think we both agreed that Durant had a much more impressive year in time played in the time that he was playing. At times having to carry that team, frankly. The other second, I air quote second because this team's unique option that neither one of us has at all mentioned, but it's a really tough spot to make this list, as we keep saying, is Donovan Mitchell. The Jazz ran away with the regular season this year. We both had Rudy on our third team, and that was kind of it. Is that speak to what the Utah Jazz do, how weird the season was, or what's the hindrance on putting Donovan Mitchell on these teams?
So I think that as far as Donovan Mitchell goes, I don't think anybody on the Jazz would be successful in that blender system if it wasn't for Gobert rolling to the rim and also setting those screens. I think he's probably the best screen setter in the league.
Yeah, you mentioned gravity with Zion earlier. I think of Rudy as a gravity guy as well. Yes. He rolls so hard. He pulls everything with him.
Absolutely. And I think that's Anthony Davis could function with that same type of vertical gravity if that's what the Lakers would emphasize. But anyway, back to Donovan Mitchell. It's just for me, it's too many 10 of 27 shooting nights. And, even when he's he gets going and he hits a couple step back threes in a row, kind of puts his dude on skates. It seems to me he's not drawing a second defender. And, in much the same way that I'm critical about Tatum, not going north-south, I think with Mitchell, it's sort of how is he, how can he move without seeming like he's always on an island? And, he's undersized. Yeah. This isn't a Tatum thing. He's not 6'7", rangy and athletic. He's athletic, long arms, but he's 6'1", 6'2". He's short.
He's a crossover guard the same way Iverson was many years ago, or the same way Steph kind of is now. He does both guard things for them.
I never liked the Dwayne Wade comparison because with Wade, he was not only one of the fastest players in the league, but he was a bowling ball going to the cup. And he couldn't shoot the same way Mitchell can, but I didn't get enough sort of I just wasn't glued to Mitchell the same way I was with the other guys ahead of him, I guess.
And it's just interesting because offensively, I guess unless you want to call the Rudy screen and roll, he is their first option, right? Like him running, initiating, puncturing the defense's action, that is what they start with, and then they rotate to get you out of rotation. They got a bunch of guys that can shoot. If you miss a rotation, they got Gobert at the rim for a dunk, right? Like it's just interesting to look at the way that team goes because they don't have a guy in the top whatever for the MVP. I think that's fine. I guess they got 2 of the 3 for 6 man of the year, which I have my own beef with. How do you have 2 6 men? Defensive player of the year, I guess that's Rudy gets that probably. Does Quinn Snyder coach here? How? I guess I look at this and like, how do we explain? Is it like a team? Is it just that much of a team game with them, or how do we explain how great their season was when come award season? It feels fairly pedestrian. They're not going to have anyone the MVP. They're not going to have maybe one guy make third team All NBA. I don't think I probably would have Monty Williams higher on my Coach of the Year stuff. Maybe I'm being anti Quinn Snyder. He looks like a supervillain. I don't know. I don't know what something feels weird about how we're not giving props to this Jazz team enough. They did run away with the league.
I think that much the same way that Giannis fell into MVP fatigue, we're sort of like whatever the opposite is of that. Like I guess like they have like I think as much to prove, especially Mitchell, as anyone in the playoffs right now. Like, are they real? Like,
yeah.
I don't know about you, but like watching game 1 of their series with Memphis, like they got punked around. Like that was, to me, that was unbecoming. Like I think there was, I don't know if it was game 1 or game 2, but there was a play where Valanciunas was battling on the interior for an offensive rebound. He got it, and he just sort of like gave Gobert an armbar.
Yeah.
And Gobert went like flopping towards his bench and like just kind of like threw his arm out of frustration. Kind of like, like how'd you miss that? Like it wasn't like he was like frustrated at Valanciunas. Like he was sort of like frustrated that like he got pushed around. And I know they're about to win like 4-1, but I haven't seen as much of them this season as I think it would have. Like they lost to the Wizards twice. Like I don't know.
I think my thing with them coming into playoffs was much my same as I would have said with Budenholzer a year ago. I liked what Budenholzer did the regular season this year, but it's show it to me in the playoffs. I need to see you change up your shtick. And the Jazz came out and punked them in the first game. It should be mentioned that Donovan Mitchell did not play the first game, but I think the whole series has been the stretches of positive plus minus minutes for Memphis have been when they're allowed to be more physical. Like when Bane's in foul trouble, or when they get the Grizzlies in foul trouble and off the floor, Utah builds their lead back up. But when Memphis has been successful, they've been very physical with them, which is interesting for a team with the DNA that I thought Utah had.
It's very. I say this as a flaw to Memphis, and Brooks. I don't know where he placed this year in fouls charged with, but last year he was number 1 in the whole league. Fouls per game.
I think he repeated there. I think he also did that again this year.
And like what's interesting about Brooks is like much the way that Mitchell's like deceivingly small, like Brooks is deceivingly big.
Yeah, but I was writing the other day and looked it up. He's 6'7", 230
with a 6'4" wingspan.
What?
Like look up his Draft Express bio. Like he has dinosaur arms. Like that's why he doesn't look as big as he actually is. But like he is a large man.
Well, and it makes you feel like, is he almost playing out of position at the 2 guard? Should he really be an undersized 4? But I don't know.
That's interesting. That's interesting. Like sort of like the way the Lakers like use like Kuzma.
Yeah.
Like yeah. I think like sort of like a power guard kind of.
Yeah, because he's tough enough to guard a big guy. We should mention that game did tip off a moment ago. It's currently 10-7 with about 9 minutes left in the first. Utah. I don't mean we could talk first team and guys all night. I want to talk a little bit about the playoffs with my next hot tea cold brew question, because we've mentioned a lot of really great players that have had struggles, if they've been available at all, in the NBA playoffs. We've also talked about guys missing games in the regular season and how that would impact their all NBA team. So my hot tea cold brew question to you, Kyle, is when we look back, these NBA playoffs will be defined by the injured players. So Chris Paul, Anthony Davis, Joel Embiid, Jaylen Brown missed the whole series. I think Dante DiVincenzo for Milwaukee is going to be big. And the list keeps going. So I look at this and I say this year will be defined by injuries in the history books or sorts. What do you think?
I don't know if it's so much injuries, but I think that if the MVP verdict will be any sort of indicator, it's that we're rewarding availability as more than anything this season. So I think what that comes down to is like sort of like luck. For instance, like you see luck every year in the postseason, and oftentimes the team who wins is the one who doesn't get injured. So, I think you look at the teams that are like staying healthy right now. Oddly enough, it's the Brooklyn Nets.
Isn't that weird that the team that they could not? We talked about how little they played 7 games together. The team that could not be healthy and continue to add pieces like Band-Aids, whether it's Marcus Aldridge, hope he's doing okay, or Blake Griffin or whomever, they continue to add those guys, and now they're the healthiest team, right? They took the regular season off.
They had more questions about that than anyone besides the Lakers, and I think like it's because of what the injuries have sort of changed the playoff landscape into. I think we're really looking at like the Brooklyn Nets have like their, the lane is cleared for them to like make a championship push. This is their year.
And so I think anyway, I was going to say it's opening up for them in a way that even when they built this team, they really had a 2-year window with all those guys on contract. And I think that it does bear to mention that like in 2 years, Durant will be into his mid-30s. Harden will be into his mid-30s just because they have a lot of wear and tear. But who'd have known that it was going to open up like this in year one? Like that's just been wild to see. Like once they beat the Bucks, they could get Philly without Joel. They could get Atlanta, who was a 5 seed. Like, and then in the West, you could get anybody, right? But it doesn't look like it's going to be LeBron and AD. Like things could get difficult. Things could open up really easy for them if they get past the Bucks really quickly.
What I'm interested to see is just something I could foresee happening is if Atlanta is able to make a push to the conference finals, and then meanwhile, if the Clippers also healthy, we should mention the Clippers are healthy right now. And if the Dallas gets bounced, like I'm interested to see how the narrative kind of like shifts, or does it shift between Trey and Luka just sort of being like star-crossed sort of like allies and rivals.
Well, so and I think the shame is I'd have no information that would say that Luka and Trey have any beef with one another, but their careers will always be linked because of that trade, fairly or unfairly. And if the Hawks get to the Eastern Conference Finals before Luka gets out of the first round, simpletons write that off as a win on the trade, even if Luka is this tremendous player, right? Like that becomes this whole talking point in the argument, right?
Exactly. And it's, narratives aren't always fair. And, when they're proven wrong, like Dirk, for instance, another Maverick, when he led Dallas to the championship, I feel like we're headed towards some Luka slander. I think that he's been given sort of like this pass, much the way sort of his counterparts haven't. Like we talk about Jokic's defense, Lillard's defense, Curry's defense more than you talk about Doncic's defense. Like, and I think that if the Clippers end up prevailing in 6 games, like it seems like they will. Shout out to Ty Lue for that adjustment of inserting Reggie Jackson for Zubac.
Yeah.
That was awesome. I love that. And I'm interested to see what the narrative around Luka Doncic becomes after this season. And that's somebody who my favorite player in the league to watch is Luka Doncic.
Well, and I like watching him play, and I like, a couple years back, I think it was Charks was writing about how similar Doncic and Harden are. I like watching James Harden in the Rockets uniform. I can watch Luka Doncic in a Mavs uniform. I think what's fascinating is he gets a lot of passes for a lot of reasons, and I'll leave it at that without trying to take give too many people too many bad vibes. But I do think that at some point, he needs to get, this, well, why aren't you out of the first round? Because we certainly give that to a lot of other guys, even if Porzingis isn't playing well or got, the bubble didn't go well for Porzingis or whatever the case may be. Blowing a 2-0 lead with, winning both games in LA, it's a team sport, but it should hurt a little bit as far as how we measure these things. Anyway, we'll see if it does. For some weird reason, I'm not as confident that it will, but something should change there. Now that I say that, they'll show up and upset the Clips tonight or something. I'm gonna jump into open container. I'm gonna skip one of our questions. I'm sorry if you're keeping track of your notes, because I've actually got 2 open container questions, and one's gonna be about Boston. Because again, when I sent you the notes for this show, for those peek behind the curtain folks at home, I sent Kyle the notes for this yesterday. Clearly, a lot of NBA news happened this morning that I would not have known about yesterday when I wrote this up. So my first open container question is going to be about Boston. And the open container, again, it's this idea that once you pop the top off of your Yeti cooler or cup or whatever, you can put anything in or out. So it's really just open conversation, whatever you got, Kyle. Open container question. The Celtics are making the right moves. What do you think?
I thought it was very interesting that at about the same time that this news came out about Stevens, news came out of Duke that Coach K was stepping down. And just I'm going to put my tin cap on for a second and just speak this into existence. But what if Stevens, who had received consideration from Indiana, had received consideration from Duke? And, all quotes point to Stevens being burnt out, wanting to make a shift to the front office. I'm interested if this was sort of appeasing Stevens because Boston wanted to hang on to him, because I just find it unusual to promote a guy from the bench to president of basketball ops when you have no executive experience. And honestly, he was a successful NBA coach, but he was coming from college before that. So
I think the college thing is worth measuring because his entire pro experience has been being the head coach for these Boston Celtics, because he didn't play professional basketball in the NBA. I guess I don't know what his overseas career might have been, but he sure didn't play. And his coaching career is 7 or 8 years. I'm not good at math with Boston, and he might know what the holes are on the roster, but how's he going to know how to go about filling them? What experience does he have with that, right?
I'm interested to see similar, Tibbs would, pick up his Bulls guys, and Doc Rivers would always pick up the guys who either played well for him or well against him in the past. But I'm interested to see who is he cutting? Who is he trying to trade? Does he bring Isaiah Thomas back? Does he bring Avery Bradley back? Does Jared Sullinger make an appearance back in the beam? I'm just from an entertainment perspective, I want to see what he does, because coaches really reveal themselves when they take these leadership roles.
Well, and there's a lot of different ways to go about this. I wonder if he can really do that job. It's weird that he gets promoted to that job without. I would argue he's underperformed lately, right? And without experience in it, and I could go on and on and on. But at the end of the day, I didn't see a lot of pushback from Boston sports Twitter, and there's a lot of vitriol there. And they were like, "Oh yeah, Danny Ainge is out, Brad Stevens." Like, I didn't see anyone like super upset about this.
I'd be interested to tune into Boston sports radio from Brockton or North Reading or somewhere on the South Shore. One of the, just the knee jerk Boston sports radio talk. Because they had to do something, that was like the feeling that I had like leaving the season for them. They had to do something, whether that was Ainge or Stevens. I felt like it was going to be one of them. I felt like they could have just used a scapegoat of COVID if they chose, but I'm surprised to see it was both of them making a pivot.
Well, and yeah, I agree. I think they had to do something. I think that was fascinating. I don't know. I thought they'd both get fired. Like point blank period. I kind of saw that coming. I just kind of thought they'd both get fired. And frankly, it's not because either one of them is necessarily inherently bad at their job. I guess my bigger thing, as I see it, is that they both get fired because they need new voices. This has played itself out. They need someone new in those young guys' ear. They need someone new as an architect because the gambles they made early didn't pay off, and they haven't been willing to take a gamble since. I don't know. I guess that's where I was with it. I think it's interesting that they really went hard in on this idea that Danny Ainge was a playing Celtic and a front office Celtic, and how like that was big in his folklore apparently with their press conference today. But I don't know. It feels like failing upwards, right? And it feels like it feels, frankly, you talk about like, was there, tin cap on, trying to keep him away from Krzyzewskiville. I wonder if I kind of wondered the inverse. Did Krzyzewski announce today because he's like, I'm not going to let so-and-so be the news today. I'm going to take this news away. I don't know. Boston's got a lot of problems. Like I said, the gambles.
I guarantee you that Boston sports media is not going to be imploring the franchise to take a more diverse sort of hiring process. Right? Just saying. It is Boston after all.
It is Boston, and they didn't clearly interview a bunch of people for the GM job, right? Like that wasn't taken. Who do you think coaches them? I have seen a bunch of rumors about former players. I'm interested to hear, who do you think coaches them?
I think that there could be a couple candidates. I would like to see him hire a former player. And whether that's, guys who had some chops with them on the bench or playing, like Chauncey Billups, such as Sam Cassell. And I understand that these are like names that are sort of like just common in any head coaching search, like Jared Vanderpool, for instance. But last time Boston was in a position to hire a head coach, they went totally out of the box. And say what you will about Stevens, he's above 500 as a coach, and it was a good hire.
And 3 Eastern Conference Finals in a 5-year span, and I think that's interesting. I had forgotten Billups had a brief stint playing there till it came up today. I think Billups is an interesting move. His brother coaches college basketball. He's an assistant coach with the Clippers. Sam Cassell and his, ties to the city. Right, he was on the 2008 team. He wasn't a starter, but he was on the 2008 team that won it all. He's an assistant with Doc in Philly. I wonder, so if you think about, like, they went to the college well last time kind of out of the blue and got Brad Stevens fairly early in his, like, meteoric rise. Like, who is that guy right now? It's not Calipari as a college guy. It's someone more akin to who?
They don't have good luck hiring Kentucky coaches.
No, so Patino went for that's fair. But I more mean like the college candidate is not as obvious to me. The mid-major guy that just had a bunch of quick success. I can't think quite off the top of my head who that'd be.
I mean, you have to look at mid-major guys that have had a lot of success. Like you'd have to go like, is it Mark Few, guys like that. But it's. I wonder if it's sort of like a David Blatt hire, where it's like they take like the European coach who's like won championships, has won leagues
that we just don't know the name of because they're in Europe right now, and feel like an idiot when it's someone that played in the NBA 15, 20 years ago that we just didn't know about.
Yeah, I don't know like their assistant coaching staff so well. Besides, like I know they got like Walter McCarty, some other former Celtics, but I'm inclined to think that they're going to sort of like hire from within. If I had to make a bet on it,
the name I'm seeing thrown around from hiring within is a guy named Jair Larrañaga. I don't know him. I guess he's been with the franchise since 2012, and he was kind of like a front chair assistant with Stevens. I don't know who that is. He's another white guy that I don't know the name of. I will say that, a guy like Lloyd Pierce, I feel like could use a second shot, right? He had his first half of the season this year with Atlanta. Nate McMillan did great. The undercurrent there that no one's talked about very often is how healthy Atlanta got around the same time. Someone's going to hire Becky Hammond. I don't think it's Boston. Anyway, Sam Cassell fits a lot of boxes as a former player. People are throwing on Kevin Garnett's name today. I don't think it's Kevin Garnett. I have no indication Garnett wants to coach.
I mean, it seems like he'd rather be in ownership of his, past actions or any indication.
Yeah, and ownership with Minnesota, frankly, which is interesting because how he defines his career is up to him. But it's interesting because there's certainly a generation of people that thinks of him as a champion Celtic, and certainly a generation of people that think of him as a tremendous player in Minnesota. The originally scheduled open container question tonight, and I want to throw this back out there, is the team with the most pressure on them in these NBA playoffs as we're speaking is blank.
I mean, I think it's tough because I think LA is going to get a pass, no matter what happens.
Lakers are
pressure. Speaking. Yeah, I'm torn between the Clippers or the Jazz, because if the Clippers have another ugly exit, we see Kawhi in Miami, Paul George, will he be traded for Ben Simmons? Like, some dominoes will fall if they lose a series to the Mavericks, or they lose like their next series in ugly fashion. But, and I think with Utah and Milwaukee, it's sort of a game of who are you really? Like, what is your championship fiber? Are you guys for real, or are you just pleading small market bias all year, and that's where you'll be next season too?
Small market bias. Just a funny joke because it's 100% what Fear the Deer Twitter will say. Like that's just how it's gonna go.
And I think, even with the Jazz, like they've lost in the past, it's always been like, we just didn't make shots.
Right. Well, it's exactly what it is. So I think there's two ways to look at pressure, right? There's pressure, like you're talking about the Clippers, which I think is very real, in that Kawhi is not guaranteed to be around. That whole thing could blow up, right, if they go out ugly. I also think there's pressure in being Brooklyn right now. You form, Thanos over there to win the whole thing and run out with it, be all the villains that no one likes. It's like when the Heat did it in 2011, and then they lost, right, to the Mavericks. And like the entire next 12 months was like, oh my God, the Heat, it didn't work out. Like the jokes went flying. I think the difference here is going into the Heat thing, we kind of liked Chris Bosh. LeBron was a love him, hate him guy. And Dwayne Wade captured a lot of people's hearts in 06, right? The three in Brooklyn don't have that. Like people hate James Harden. People hate Kevin Durant. People hate Kyrie Irving. They don't have all that. I think there is a weird pressure on them because we talk about the gates opening up and how Philly's kind of down. And I think the Dante DiVincenzo thing in Milwaukee is bigger than people making out. So it's a starting two guard. Right?
I don't think it's that big.
What's up?
I don't think it's that big. I
It changes the starting lineup, and I think that the versatility was important. But I'm also might be too much on it. He was not going to be able to guard. He was guarding Joe Harris, so like it's not like he's anything crazy. They also have a 2-year window to me that like if not now, when? And I don't know. There is no pressure to me on these teams that came out of nowhere like Atlanta. Atlanta, I should point out, did beat the Knicks and move on tonight. They'll get
Denver's house money.
Denver's house money because Jamal Murray's hurt. Portland, maybe? Do you see Portland blowing it up if things don't go well?
I wanted to touch on that because it seems as though Dame's clock is running like he's about to hit midnight because he's early 30s. He plays in a small backcourt. They're always bottom 5 in D, and it just seems like he can like only take them so far. And I don't think that's any fault of his, and I don't think anybody would ever blame him. But it just what's the price of loyalty? And in Washington, we always ask this about Bradley Beal, like why don't we get off Beal? Like why don't we get Wiseman? Like why don't we get a top 5 pick? And with Lillard, it's like he has so much more equity than a Bradley Beal does, and I would just like to see him go to a Brooklyn. And I don't know what that Brooklyn is and like what it will be, but like I would just like to see him play with players of his caliber and not just sort of like miss the last years of his prime 12 threes and in and out because guys are missing corner threes, they're turning the ball over, they're missing dunks. It's sad.
You see it as moving him to help him, not breaking up he and CJ and swapping out CJ and pieces to bring in some other stud. You think the deal is sending him somewhere where he can be successful and you blow it up?
I think it's much the same as like Garnett when they trade him from Minnesota to Boston.
Yeah.
But it's also like the pressure isn't on Dame. It's on the front office. It's Terry Stotts is done. That's what all reports say. And
yeah, that was on early, and frankly, if they want to make Dame happy, they'll go get Vanderpool because he was upset Vanderpool didn't get the Minnesota job, right? Anyway, I don't know what the solution there is. And I say this as a guy, like Dame Lillard broke our heart as a Rockets guy in 2014, right? Like he made the series ending fall away shot. It's tough to watch a guy work that hard to be a first round exit.
Didn't trail the screen. Parsons trailed the screen. You shouldn't have done that. Sorry.
No, that was Harden's defense was much to be critiqued, or still frankly is, but not as much as it wasn't. I also think that there's Parsons, Harden, and Beverly were all in that screen action. Cover Dame, make someone else beat you. Anyway, that's 7-8 years ago. My big thing is I feel bad watching that guy work that hard, and he has been to Western Conference Finals that felt fluky, but they were still fluky. Like they got there and got swept by the Warriors without Durant a couple years ago, right? Like it
Steph's 10-0 against Dame in the playoffs.
Right, and I don't know that Steph is probably better than Damian Lillard on his career, and I don't mean to say he's not. I don't know he's 10-0 better, right? Like that's when the team and the front office and all those things come into play to shrink that gap, and they're not working in his favor. Like Carmelo Anthony's fun. He's a sixth man, and he's like a big part of what they do.
So he and Cantor are much. It's kind of the same player as they're gonna shoot your team in the foot when it comes to playing defense. But
yeah,
with Melo, what I think is really cool is that when you play in late game situations, and you should only play him on offense. Like you got to make those offensive defensive substitutions. But because these old stars, they just never lose this ability to if you double them, they're not going to get rattled.
No,
if the ball goes to them in the backcourt, they're going to get the foul call. Those are guys that are not going to be scared in those situations, but they're not guys you want on the court when it comes to playoff basketball and playoff defense. and that'll get you wins in the regular season. But that's not you're not going anywhere with those guys.
And I haven't read as much on it about cancer, although there's a reason he's still in the league. I think part of the benefit to having Carmelo is you also want him in the locker room. I think people look up, the young players look up to Carmelo. They remember watching him play. They have to play him a lot. And it's not because they have other guys to play, I don't mean. We could talk about that at a different podcast. But the truth is that they have to play him a lot. And that says something about their team. Quickly, if we keep it moving, Wednesday Night Writes, a segment where we talk about things we wrote or read this week. You got anything interesting out there, Kyle, that you wrote or read this week?
Oh, I haven't done much writing recently, but I do a lot more listening. Just easier to fit that into my life.
That's fair game. Who you been listening to?
I used to be big into like Win Hurst Low, like Amino Hassan, Waz, but I've recently come to Nate Duncan and Danny LaRue. I understand that Nate Duncan's kind of a polarizing figure in NBA media, but shout out to that guy for being an independent podcaster
and doing well.
And I just appreciate that you can put on their podcast and they don't argue. It's not they just sensational sports media. Let's butt heads over anything and everything. I just appreciate that they can just have in-depth conversations, and they can take different points, but it's not competitive. And
yeah,
it's a breath of fresh air for me. And that's why I enjoy it. And I can just leave it in the background because they'll do a 2.5 hour podcast on the playoffs, and
right.
That's badass. How can you do that? How can you talk so in depth about every team? Anyway, that's what I've been listening to.
So
how about yourself?
I was gonna say one thing I read by this guy, but based on the vibe you've got, first of all, Nate Duncan's a great guy for what he does. If you're looking for numbers and data and in-depth analysis, because he watches in-depth every game with a notepad, Nate Duncan's great, right? You talk about a guy that watches that much basketball and does 2.5 hours. I'm big on I was going to point out a thing I'd read about Ben Simmons by a guy named Nikias Duncan. Nikias is great. Nikias works for the group called the Basketball News Network. He does a
Dunker
podcast
Spot.
in a similar vibe. What's up?
The Dunker Spot.
The Dunker Spot. It's a great show. They do it they have a weekly show, but in the playoffs, they've been doing more 2 or 3 times a week. Frankly, they're probably live right now, as I'm saying that. But he wrote a whole thing about Ben Simmons as the 5, and he, we talked about a point forward earlier. He was statistically and with clips breaking down how the next step for Philadelphia, if they really want to make a run with half of Joel Embiid, maybe, is to play a point center, not unlike Jokic, but with a lot more speed in Philadelphia. And it's really, really interesting. Nikias is really, really smart. The show with he and Steve Dillon is really funny, the Dunker Spot. He's on other podcasts too, as a guest, but that's his main show. I also wanted to point out today, and looking at what was going on with the Celtics, I don't always read KOC. You talk about sensationalists. There are times that KOC and the Ringer crew does seem kind of like that. And he and Vern you talk about people that argue. He and Vernon will just argue. But KOC is a diehard Boston guy, right? And so when big news happens in Boston and he writes something, I go read it. And he wrote a whole thing about Brad Stevens and Danny Ainge, and kind of just investigating if Brad Stevens can be a GM. And there's not really an answer by the end of it. He kind of presents both sides and just kind of says, we'll see. And it clearly was written, he didn't have insight before today this is going to happen. It doesn't have any indication of that. And so it was interesting to read because he's a Boston Celtics guy. And then, I could point out other guys in the Ringer that are fun to read. It's good to see Charks is back in podcast again. Charks he got diagnosed with stage 4 cancer a couple of weeks ago, but he's clearly feeling okay enough that while he's fighting that to be on podcasts, and so that's always good. He was on a couple of the NBA shows recently from the Ringer.
I will also, right before I just want to shout out Seth Part now. I'm big into analytic writing. Just right. I like learning about what I'm seeing that I can't define, and some of his stuff, talking about double teams and what luck adjusted field goal percentage, that stuff's fascinating to me. So That's what I've been enjoying lately.
Well, and what's fascinating there too is that if you look at it, like, numbers should not change what you think unless it's like just completely out of left field, right? But like numbers to help validate, like, I noticed this trend in the game and I can't figure out what's going on. Like, that's where the numbers come in, right? Like, I could tell that Rudy Gobert really impacted the game, even though we only had 12 points. I could tell the way the defense is, and he seemed to be touching the ball a lot, even though we had 12 points. And then you look at like percentage of, analytically looking at like how many points they get where he's the pick and roll action and like those kind of things.
Screen assist.
Utah loves their screen assist. Don't get take note Twitter involved. Do you have a take for buzzer beaters?
I sort of got into it with my Lillard, sort of like, it's sad. Like, while celebrating Lillard, like I felt sad. Like, it was sad to see, just this effort, like, just return not. And it's sort of been the story of his career. And, I think I'm just interested to see when he steps away from the game, what he reflects on he should have done differently.
Well, that's interesting. My buzzer beater, and we can do it much more casually because we're running long on time, but I like talking, so I'm not mad about it. My buzzer beater was going to be about how no one's talking about Jokic getting 38, 11, and 9. Like, he also, like, how he got 38, 11, and 9. He won the game. He's going to be the MVP. And he's not the story.
Pass I've seen all season, too. That cross-court dime off the double team to Porter Jr. in the corner.
Who is the cutter? Because Porter's in the corner.
That was Gordon was the cutter.
Yes.
Like, they do like a good, like, sort of like weak side, sort of like, high low sort of like movement.
He's got Gordon his back cuts, to it. He's got just like
Covington takes one step. Covington takes one step to Gordon cutting, and Jokic just like fires it like right over his head, falls on the ground. I appreciate the effort by Covington because he's really one of the best weak side defenders in the game. And like just in Porter, I don't know how you feel about best shooting motions in the league, but I think Porter's right up there with Davis Bertans for me.
Well,
and Clay.
Well, and clearly you got Clay as a pro's son. Porter is a pro and a coach's son. I don't think those things are unrelated. But the way that pass whipped across there, I clipped out the highlight and sent it with the Midweek Midrange Twitter because just phenomenal. The kind of thing where if you put a like bullseye target and said you got $100 if you hit the target itself, it'd be hard to just hit the target with all the moving arms and stuff and the angle he's sitting at. And then he hit the fucking bullseye. Like he
got the giant panda.
Like, unbelievable. And frankly, he hit the bullseye in a game that went to double overtime. Like, every basket counted. Funniest part of the game is Austin Rivers praying after Dame Lillard missed a shot at one point in the end of this first overtime. But no, my thing was just going to be like, I don't think we shouldn't talk about Dame's efforts. I don't mean to take away from him. I mean, 55 points and 24 shots is just absurd. Like, dear Jesus, that's crazy. But Jokic had a tremendous game and won. It just felt like we weren't talking about that at all today on Sports Talk. It was Boston this, Duke that, nah. Jokic played phenomenally. Talk about him.
The MVP.
The MVP played phenomenally. Kyle, tell people where they can find you, what you're doing these days. What's up?
So taking a little break from sports writing, but never stop watching basketball. Working at a mass vaccination clinic in Salisbury, Maryland. But you can always find me on Twitter at Kyle Edwards, KLEEDWORDS. And yeah, just my advice with the NBA playoffs is just I don't have anything. I thought I had something there. I thought I could expound on pontificate just by getting myself some rhythm. But nonetheless, Parker, why don't you tell us where we can find you?
Well, first of all, I want to say, just as a citizen, I know you're saying you're taking a break from sports writing, but you're doing good things. So thank you for doing that. Like, that's important. And you can find me at Painter512. It's my personal stuff. This show is at Midweek Midrange. All that is on Twitter and Instagram. I'm also on a show that comes out audio only on Mondays. It's wherever you get your podcast, called FN Sports, where teachers are grading sports topics. That's about all sports, not just basketball. So different week to week. But yeah, and then I also write some for Belly Up. We're going to rope Kyle back in once he's done saving the world one day. But with that, you got any parting thoughts, Kyle, before we call it a day?
Parting thoughts. Fan behavior. I don't think the NBA does anything.
So we kind of skipped over that to talk about the Celtics, but we were at one point going to talk tonight about, does the NBA do anything? I think they should, but I'm kind of in the same boat. That's the paying customer. Like, the NBA is clearly not. They need the money.
They got the best ticket in sports, courtside seat. They can offer that intimacy and that closeness that other sports cannot. It's damned if I do, damned if I don't. If you're Adam Silver, and that's my parting thought this week.
Well, damned. All right. On that note, we're gonna wrap it up. Thanks everyone for pulling up tonight. It went a little long, but it's okay. It's basketball night. You're out there watching basketball. Y'all take care. See ya.